This hearing will come to order. The title of this hearing is Financially Rewarding Terrorism in the West Bank. And as everyone here knows, last week a 13-year-old Israeli-American girl was stabbed to death by a Palestinian terrorist while she slept in her bed. Sadly, Hallel Ariel's murder is only the latest attack in Israel, because since October there have been 250 instances of Israelis being chased down, shot, or stabbed. 40 have died, including former U.S. Army officer Taylor Force, who was stabbed in March along an oceanfront boardwalk. While this spree of attacks continues, international diplomats continue to meet for a probable push at the United Nations this fall to impose the parameters of peace on Israel and the Palestinian Authority. But what on earth suggests that Israel has a willing partner in peace at this time? Last fall, this committee held a hearing to expose the Palestinian Authority's complicity in inciting violence. Israel is contending with a deep-seated hatred nurtured by Palestinian leaders over many years, nurtured in mosques, in schools, in newspapers, nurtured on television, on radio. As one witness told the committee, incitement is the term we usually use, but hatred is what we mean, teaching generations of Palestinian children to hate Jews by demonizing and dehumanizing them. So take the funeral for the killer of American Taylor Force, former West Point graduate, U.S. Army officer, Vanderbilt student. Official PA TV glorified the terrorist, calling him a martyr 11 times in the broadcast I watched. A reporter explained that his funeral was a large national wedding benefiting of martyrs. But Palestinians are lured to terrorism with more than just words. Since 2003, it has been Palestinian law to reward Palestinian prisoners in Israeli jails with a monthly paycheck. Legislation which creates jihad. This jihad legislation, under this act, the Palestinian Authority and the Palestinian Liberation Organization use a so-called Martyrs Fund to pay the families of Palestinian prisoners and suicide bombers. One prominent Palestinian says that these inducements have become sacred in Palestinian politics. You know, as a member of one concerned family here today reminded me, these terrorists are not, in fact, lone rangers. They're not lone wolves acting from their independent hatred. Instead, these terrorists are the product of the programming done by the PA's perverted culture that glorifies the willingness to die or to spend time in prison in pursuit of killing or maiming Israelis. The PA programmed this hate. These financial rewards are the main way they accomplish this. And perversely, the PA uses a sliding scale. The more the mayhem, the longer the jail sentence, then the greater the financial reward. The highest payments go to those serving life sentences, to those who prove most brutal, and as we will hear today, the PA allots $140 million of its budget for this purpose. The monthly salary ranges from $364 a month for 3 years imprisonment to over $3,000 a month for 30 years or more, and whoever hits the bar, whoever was imprisoned for 5 years or more, and we know what kind of attack would create that, that individual is entitled to permanent employment in what? In the PA institution itself. Again, for those who wage the most brutal attacks, If a Palestinian state was established, it's hard to see how this pay-to-slay policy wouldn't put them on the state sponsor of terrorism list today. With about 1/3 of the Palestinian Authority's budget financed through foreign aid, the U.S. and our European allies can and must help stop the bloodshed. So far, the international community has failed to effectively use its leverage. European donors admit they provide funding in a way that is impossible to track. They have nothing in their laws like the U.S. requirement, which the Israeli government is now starting to embrace, that funding to the PA be cut by the amount the PA pays out for acts of terrorism. This must change, and if the PA's irresponsible behavior continues, the whole premise for funding the PA needs to be reconsidered. The U.S. needs to do better at bringing the parties together while holding the parties responsible for their actions. This has traditionally been our role. Unfortunately, in recent years, the Obama administration has been hesitant to hold the PA accountable, yet has consistently pressured Israel. It's no wonder the Palestinian Authority believes they can go straight to the United Nations this fall, bypassing Israel and bypassing bilateral negotiations. Indeed, the Obama administration has pointedly not ruled out allowing the UN Security Council to dictate the terms of peace negotiations. The United States should make it abundantly clear that we oppose such actions which are not based on direct negotiations between the parties, and will use our veto and keep divisive, counterproductive resolutions from passing. We have to face reality if we're going to move peace forward, and we have to be honest about each actor's readiness to make peace. The sad truth is the Palestinian Authority has not prepared its citizens for peace with Israel. Quite the opposite. And tragically, there will be no peace until that changes. And I now turn to the ranking member for any opening comments Mr. Elliot Engel of New York may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for calling this morning's hearing. The threats facing Israel and the challenges to reaching a two-state solution are growing every day, and I'm glad the committee is focusing on this. I want to thank all our witnesses as well. Welcome to the Foreign Affairs Committee. We're grateful for your time and your expertise. I especially want to welcome back former Congressman Robert Wexler, who spent many hours on this side of the dais on the Foreign Affairs Committee, sitting next to me. It's good to have you back, Robert, and thanks to our other witnesses as well. Thank you for joining us. Before I start with my statement, I want to offer my condolences to the family of Hallel Yafa Ariel. She was the young Israeli girl, 13 years old, who was stabbed to death in her own bedroom by a 17-year-old Palestinian boy. It's just hard to fathom, but that's what we end up with after years and years of incitement to violence. The chairman and I have talked about this ad nauseum with the Palestinian leadership. Everyone will hear us. You cannot have incitement and expect to have peace. Young people in classrooms taught to hate a group of people regarded as less than human. This doesn't solve any problems. It creates new ones, like this disgrace of this poor girl. Of course, when the Palestinian leadership, whether it be the PLO or the Palestinian Authority, sends money to convicted terrorists and their families, it's no wonder that individuals are incentivized to commit acts of violence. This culture of incitement must end. It is absolutely outrageous to pay cold-blooded killers and call them martyrs. It's just disgraceful. At a time when U.S. money is going to the Palestinian Authority, for them to do this just makes you scratch your head. It's not acceptable, and it is not tolerable, and it won't be tolerated. Of course, the culture of incitement needs to end because the loss of innocent life is unacceptable, and it must end because violence and terrorism will never lead to a two-state solution. I have repeatedly said to the Palestinians, they will never achieve their state on the backs of terrorism, just plain and simple. I believe they're entitled to their state in a two-state solution, but they will never get it if they think terrorism is the way to go. In my view, a two-state solution is the only way for Israel to remain both a Jewish state and a democracy, but right now a number of roadblocks are keeping that solution out of reach. First, Israel faces threats on every border. Some of Israel's enemies possess incredibly sophisticated missile systems. Others are lone wolf terrorists carrying forward the recent wave of violence we've seen. With this feeling of being under siege, the Israeli public's confidence in a peaceful solution continues to erode. What else would you expect? The idea of living side by side with your Arab neighbors seems like a remote possibility, and this is precisely what the violent extremists want. At the same time, Israel faces mounting threats to its physical security. There's a growing effort to undermine Israel's legitimacy. The so-called BDS, Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions movement, shameful and disgraceful in my opinion, pushes Israel to make unilateral concessions outside of direct negotiations with the Palestinians. The BDS movement is totally at odds with a negotiated two-state solution, which in my opinion should remain our focus. So how do we resume progress toward that goal? Frankly, I think gatherings like the Paris peace talks last month are an unhelpful distraction because neither the Israelis nor the Palestinians were involved. How can powers come together and think they'll come up with a solution without the two parties at the table? It just doesn't make sense. The only way to have peace and settle the Palestinian situation is face-to-face talks between Israelis and Palestinians. There can be no imposition of a peace plan from the outside. The UN is a farce. Israel cannot get a fair hearing at the UN. Why should Israel submit itself to such things? Direct negotiations between the parties, and the Palestinians have to understand they have to make concessions. I point out to people that in the past couple of decades, there were 2 times that a two-state solution seemed like a possibility in terms of an agreement. Once in 2001 with Yasser Arafat, and then in 2008 with Mahmoud Abbas. Ehud Barak was Prime Minister of Israel, and then Ehud Olmert was Prime Minister of Israel. The Israelis said yes, they were willing to make painful concessions. And at the end, ultimately, the Palestinians said no and backed out because they talk about right of return and all kinds of other roadblocks. If there are 2 states and there's a two-state solution, Palestinians get the right of return to the Palestinian state, not to the Israeli state, not to the Jewish state. And if the Palestinians want peace, they certainly haven't demonstrated it, in my opinion, at all. We know what the unresolved issues are: borders, security, refugees, Jerusalem, and a mutual recognition of the end of the conflict. That would require the Palestinians to recognize Israel as a state for the Jewish people with equal rights for all its citizens. And I believe the Palestinians' refusal to do this is one of the main reasons there is no Palestinian state today. We also know what the pitfalls are of resuming talks. Every time there's a new initiative, expectations soar, and each time the talks fall apart, things seem to crash a little harder. That outcome leads to violence. Extremists find a louder voice, and people on both sides suffer. And it's interesting, every time it seems like there might be some kind of an agreement, you have violent terrorism to try and destroy it because the terrorists don't want peace. They want to keep the pot stirring. Just look in Gaza, where Hamas has tightened its grip over the last decade. And let's remember that Hamas is a terrorist organization. Reconstruction is slowly progressing. Israel has expanded the fishing perimeter in the Mediterranean, granted thousands of work permits, and improved access to telecom technology. What has Hamas done? Rebuilt its terror tunnel network. And the chairman and I were there in those tunnels, and so we saw firsthand what Hamas builds. And periodically fire rockets and missiles into Israel, terrorizing innocent people, forcing them to run for their lives to the nearest shelter. In this context, I want to voice my support for a new long-term memorandum of understanding, an MOU between the U.S. and Israel. We want to stop this horrific violence, but as long as Israel faces these threats, we need to stand with them and help ensure their defense and security. I urge the administration to bend over backwards to negotiate an MOU with Israel that will let Israel keep its qualitative military age and strengthen Israel against all these threats that it faces from terrorists. So I'll wrap up by saying there aren't any easy answers. And to our witnesses, we're glad to have your voices in the mix. I look forward to your testimony. Again, as the chairman said, I agree with what he said. It is just outrageous to pay cold-blooded killers who murder innocent civilians and call them martyrs. I cannot think of anything more disgusting. So I look forward to the testimony of our witnesses, and I yield back.
Thank you. This morning, we're pleased to be joined by a distinguished panel. We have Mr. David Pollock, Kaufman Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, and previously Dr. Pollock served as a senior advisor for the broader Middle East at the State Department. Mr. Yigal Carmon is president and founder of the Middle East Media Research Institute, and prior to founding this organization, he was a counterterrorism advisor to 2 Israeli prime ministers. The Honorable Robert Wexler is president of the S. Daniel Abraham Center for Middle East Peace, and previously Congressman Wexler served as a member of this committee and served in the House of Representatives from 1997 to 2010. He represented Florida's 19th District. We welcome him back to the committee. And so without objection, the witnesses' full prepared statements will be made part of the record. Members here will have 5 calendar days to submit any statements or any questions of our witnesses or any extraneous material for the record, and we will start with Dr. David Pollock.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, honorable colleagues, and distinguished fellow speakers, for this opportunity to meet with you today. I am truly honored by it, and I greatly appreciate both this very prestigious forum and the significance of the issue at hand. But I believe if there is one thing that most Americans, Israelis, and Arabs would agree on today, it is that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict right now is not the most important or the most urgent conflict in the Middle East or for U.S. foreign policy. And for that reason, I would argue that now is precisely the wrong time to put the Israeli-Palestinian issue near the top of our foreign policy priorities. And also, I would argue that certain current ideas about doing that, about putting this issue at the top of our priorities, carry a very real, albeit unwitting, risk of doing more harm than good. I agree with the statement of the chairman and of the ranking member that multilateral diplomatic maneuvers, whether in Paris or at the United Nations, have one central and inescapable flaw. By definition, they encourage one or both parties to imagine that they can somehow avoid making compromises and ultimately peace with each other. This is not merely a matter of avoiding direct Israeli-Palestinian bilateral negotiations. It is also a matter of avoiding responsibility for the indispensable compromises that would make real peace possible. And that is why, simply put, the Palestinian Authority has become so enamored of this shortcut or escape hatch over the past several years. Doing multilateral initiatives in the absence of direct negotiations is not, as is sometimes said, better than nothing. It is, in fact, worse than nothing, because it actually helps prevent rather than promote peace. Now, what I would like to do in the few minutes that I have left is to focus on what I believe would be some more constructive steps to look forward rather than backward. First, and most urgently, I believe the United States should enhance its support for Israeli-Palestinian security cooperation. Despite all of the incitement coming from the Palestinian Authority, security cooperation with Israel continues. And this is the bedrock of any work to stabilize the situation and ultimately reconcile the parties. The United States supports this effort, and that support, I believe, should not only continue but intensify. Second, as my colleague Dennis Ross has written recently, and as I wrote at the Washington Institute as far back as 2008, I think the United States should revive a deal with Israel about limiting settlement activity, roughly along the lines of the Bush-Sharon letter and related understandings of 2005. Israel could announce that it will cease new construction beyond the security barrier, or just act in that fashion without a declaration, in return for a U.S. commitment to cease criticizing that settlement construction, that limited settlement construction. Third, the U.S. should quietly encourage Israel and the Palestinians to agree on new practical forms of economic cooperation and of people-to-people interaction, including interfaith Jewish-Muslim dialogue. The more these people-to-people projects can be scaled up, the more they are likely to make a positive difference. There is currently a bipartisan bill, H.R. 1489, to create an international fund for precisely that purpose. I respectfully urge you to give this bill your full support in the firm conviction that it will pay multiple dividends in the coming years. Fourth, the United States should actively explore new ideas for enlisting Arab backing for Israeli-Palestinian peace. Fifth, and finally, the United States should publicly support and very vocally encourage others to endorse what we used to call mutual and balanced, but if necessary, unilateral steps toward peaceful coexistence. Israel, for example, could stop the demolition of Palestinian buildings. The Palestinian Authority could stop referring to murderers as, quote, martyrs, unquote. The Palestinian Authority and Israel could endorse new programs of interfaith dialogue to advance tolerance, nonviolence, and peaceful coexistence, and so on. I would be happy during the question and answer period to expand on these and other specific, I hope, constructive ideas. With that, I offer my sincere thanks once again to the committee and to you, Mr. Chairman, for this opportunity to share my thoughts on this important topic. Thank you.
Mr. Carmon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, ranking members, members of the committee. My testimony is dedicated to the financial support given by the Palestinian Authority to prisoners and to families of martyrs who continued their terrorist activities after the Oslo Accord of 1993, in which Arafat committed on behalf of the Palestinian people to end all forms of terrorism, and by that commitment won recognition among nations. By providing this support, the PLO, at the amount of $300 million per year, the PLO violates Oslo, encourages terrorism, and by using or misusing, actually, the money of donor countries, including the United States, it makes them unwillingly complicit to this act, to supporting terrorism. Let me deal with the details of this support. The PA distributes the money through two bodies of the PLO. One is the Palestinian National Fund, which deals with the prisoners and distributes the money through another commission of detainees, and the other is the Institute for the Caring of Families of Martyrs. The support for prisoners is anchored in a series of laws, chiefly Law Number 14 and Law Number 19 of 2004 and Law Number 1 of 2013. The law describes the prisoners as a fighting sector whose rights and the rights of their families must be assured without discrimination. What does these words mean? They mean that Hamas, terrorists, and Islamic Jihad, PFLP, others, like a squad that bombed the cafeteria of the Hebrew U in 9 years after Oslo, in which 4 Americans were killed, will get support, like the killers of Taylor Force and their families. I hold in my hand documents which I hope to include in the testimony. We got them this morning, which demonstrate from PA official documents that they get this support. What are they entitled to? They get salaries, jobs, exemptions in education, healthcare, and more. Years in jails are calculated as years of seniority in government service, and priority in jobs are given to those who were personally involved in acts of terrorism. The annual amount reaches $140 million, and the implementation of the laws is through a series of decisions by the PA government, particularly Decision 23 of 2010, which set the levels of salaries. As you had mentioned, Mr. Chairman, it's $364 per month to those who were sentenced to 3 years, up to $3,120 to those who were sentenced to 30 years for more brutal acts. There is a special supplement for Jerusalemites of $78 per month, and for Israeli Arabs at the level of $130 per month above the regular salary. They also get the money for the canteen in jail at the level of no less than $780,000 per year. At times when there is tension between the PA and the other organizations, the President Abbas doesn't hesitate to cut them down, cut the salaries down. More on that you will find in my written testimony. Let me move to the issue of the families of martyrs, which is the second group. The general amount is $173 million per year, and these are distributed not by any specific law, but by the laws that dominate social affairs, the conditions of the family, and so on. But here again, it is without these two magic words, without discrimination. Namely, President Abbas and the PA claim to follow a peaceful political path, different than that of the other Palestinian organizations who follow the path of armed struggle and jihad. But at the same time, they fund all those who follow the terrorist violent path. It is not just about incitement to violence, it is about funding it. It is about guaranteeing an environment supportive of terror. In conclusion, one can understand the PLO's commitment to support families of martyrs in the era before Oslo in the context of an overall peaceful reconciliation. But the fact that the PA supports those who continue terrorist activity after Oslo for many years now, using donor countries' money, is a basic violation of the Oslo Accords and a deliberate encouragement of terrorism. This is a situation the donor countries never meant or wanted, and it is in their hands to put an end to it. Mr. Chairman, much more details are in my written testimony. I wish to thank you again for this opportunity to present the facts of this support.
Thank you, Mr. Carmon. Mr. Robert Wexler.
Chairman Royce, Ranking Member Engel, members of the committee, thank you very much for your warm welcome. Israel's often coined the startup nation, highlighting the Jewish state's economic miracle and technological and scientific achievements. Just as remarkable is another defining characteristic. Against all odds, Israeli military forces have successfully defended against an onslaught of hostile forces since 1948. For those of us who are Zionists, the unprecedented security collaboration between the United States and Israel is a source of tremendous pride. The joint development of missile defense technologies, all-time high intelligence sharing, historic military training exercises, and the recent delivery of the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter all demonstrate the unbreakable bond between us and Israel. American administrations and Congress after Congress have ensured Israel's qualitative military advantage. Israel's defense and intelligence coordination with Egypt and Jordan is unprecedented. Despite these positive developments, the Middle East Quartet report that was released last week asserted that the policies of both Israelis and Palestinians have distanced a two-state outcome, creating a dynamic in which a one-state reality has taken root. The quartet calls on the Palestinian Authority to stop incitement of violence, bolster efforts to prevent terrorism, and importantly, condemn attacks against Israelis. Likewise, the quartet calls on Israel to cease settlement expansion, transfer civilian authority to the PA and Area C of the West Bank, and bluntly questions Israel's long-term intentions. With this backdrop of despair and lack of trust on both sides, a stunning development has occurred. The most compelling group now advocating for a two-state solution is the Israeli security establishment. 2 weeks ago, a group of over 200 retired generals or equivalent rank from the Israeli Defense Forces, Mossad, Shin Bet, and Israel Police redirected the political discourse. Boldly, Israel's most patriotic soldiers cast aside the question of whether Israel does or does not have a genuine partner for peace. Rather, these security giants demand that Israel once again determine her own destiny. The Israeli plan, labeled Security First, assumes a two-state final status arrangement is not currently feasible. It is impossible to eradicate terrorism through force alone. Continuation of the diplomatic impasse will lead to further violence, and Israel is strong enough to offer an independent initiative that combines security, civil, economic, and political measures. In the security realm, the IDF will remain deployed in the West Bank until a final status arrangement is reached, and the security fence will be completed, enhancing security within the Green Line and for 80% of Israelis living in the West Bank. In the civil economic realm, the welfare of Palestinians will be improved by establishing an international fund to rehabilitate Palestinian communities and increasing work permits. Importantly, the Knesset should pass an evacuation compensation law encouraging settlers now living east of the security fence, outside the security fence, to relocate west of the fence. What an impactful message that would send about Israeli intentions. In the political realm, Israel should accept the Arab Peace Initiative with adjustments to accommodate Israel's security and demographic needs as a basis for negotiations, acknowledge that Palestinian neighborhoods of East Jerusalem will be part of the future Palestinian state, and implement a freeze on settlement expansion east of the security fence, like Dr. Pollack mentioned. In Gaza, reconciliation with Turkey is an important opportunity to hold the ceasefire, address humanitarian needs, and promote economic development, including a seaport subject to Israeli security and PA control. Mr. Chairman, why have Israel's most decorated security officials grown frustrated with their own government's lack of initiative? Israel's top military minds have come to understand the inescapable truth that the creation of a demilitarized Palestinian state is not a gift to the Palestinians. Rather, it is the only way Israel will remain a Jewish and democratic state. In conclusion, Mr. Chairman, democratic trends clarify the need for separation. The Jewish population from the Mediterranean Sea to the Jordan River is now 52%. In 2020, it will be 49%. In 2030, only 44% Jewish. separation into two states following the Security First plan is essential for Israel to remain a democratic, Jewish majority state. Thank you.
Thank you. We're going to go with a question I have to Mr. Comon. The PA has, as you know, long faced a lot of criticism from Western governments for its policy of paying Palestinian prisoners or the families of prisoners in Israeli jails. And we here in Congress have, you know, consistently passed legislation over the last few years that requires restrictions on financial aid to the Palestinian Authority based on the amount spent on these salaries. The problem that I want to raise is one, as you note in your testimony, where you say, bowing to international pressure, the PA stopped paying from one PA ministry only to restart the payment through an arm of the PLO. And this duplicity was not explained to us by our government at the time that we did some cross-examination on this. Now it is surfacing. Can you help walk us through that change? When was it made? How hard is it to track? Give us the details on what happened there.
Yes, sir. In May 14, under the pressure of donor countries, the PA made a deliberate act of a move of misleading those countries by transferring the distribution of the money that comes from the PA to a body of the PLO. It created a virtual body, I should say, called the Commission for Detainees and Ex-Detainees Affairs, which belongs to the PLO, but it was virtual in the sense that the offices remained the same offices. The man in charge was the same man, Issa Karaka, with a different job title. The supervision or oversight of the distribution of the money remained the same, and it was all an answer to this pressure, which was specified by the minister at the time of the affairs of the prisoners, Mr. Ziad Abu Ain, who said we had to do it because of the pressure of donor countries, which began different investigations about how we spend this money. So this was the idea. We pass it to the PLO, and this is the end of the story.
And as I recall, in terms of the dollar amount, it was precisely the same amount.
Absolutely.
To the dollar that was transferred.
Yep.
How much of the annual PA budget is taken up by these salaries to terrorists? What percentage?
This is hard to determine because no one knows really what is the PA general budget. Much of it is hidden. There are different bodies that are dealing with it. But I would say that by the
known budget
information, by the online and by media, it would be about 10%.
About 10%
Yes.
goes to reward people to carry out attacks, stabbings, and shootings of the Israeli population.
Mr. Chairman, the president of the Palestinian Authority said openly that this is the main concern of the Palestinians, that this is the prisoners are a fighting sector of our society, and they
but most of these prisoners are young people. You know, the targeting goes to children. The targeting goes to youth. They're recruiting young people. I saw one of the recordings the other day of a girl who looked no more than 5. Maybe she was 4. What message would you send to other children? And she has a knife in her hand, and she says, stab, 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 is the message she sends. That is the kind of programming. In Congress here, over and over again, we repeat this theme. If you want to make peace, you have to teach peace. This is what we keep conveying to the Palestinian Authority. But what we are watching on their television is exactly the opposite. Maybe you can comment on this messaging and what it constitutes.
Mr. Chairman, Memory has been monitoring the Arab and Palestinian media amongst it for almost 20 years. And what we see in the Palestinian media, and now it's virtual, it's online, and it goes all over the world, is a constant legitimization of the armed action, of the killing of Israelis and Jews, and much of the terminology refers to Jews. Kill the Jews. We have so much material online in our website, memory.org, which shows it in a quite graphic way, pictures of the actual killing, reacting and acting in a kindergarten of the terrorist acts to tell people, this is the model, tell kids, this is your model. But there is more than that. There is actual training through the internet of how to do it.
On how to do it.
Not just stab as it comes to you, but where to hit. And there are instructions, and there are instructions to use poison, to use with which knives to deal, and of course to use any weapon possible, not necessarily weapons, but cars and trucks and other ways, whatever is in your capability, kill, kill, kill.
And these are official Palestinian Authority media?
Much of it is on the Palestinian official media, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, my time has expired. I'll go to Mr. Elliot Engel of New York.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We all know that the Palestinian Authority has not lived up to its promises, and we are talking about their incitement against Israelis and Jews. And we know that the disgusting spectacle of paying terrorists for crimes, for murderers, calling them martyrs, is just something that really irks all of us. But on the other hand, you look at President Abbas. He's just completed 11 years of his 4-year term. He threats to quit all the time. I'd like to hear anybody's response about, should we worry about the PA collapse? There are no prize packages, but breathing down their neck is Hamas. Is that something that we should be worried about if the PA just totally collapsed? Could Hamas take over? Would the Israelis have something on their hands that they really would not want to go in and retake the area? Any thoughts of the matter? I have no regard for Abbas and what he's done, but what about the potential of the collapse of the PA? Anybody would care to answer? Mr. Wexler.
Mr. Engel raises an important point. President Abbas presents a mixed bag at best, and he's responsible ultimately for all of the atrocities that have been outlined this morning. But there's also another aspect, which is that collaboration between the PA and Israel is in fact quite substantial. Now, Abbas isn't collaborating with the Israeli security forces because he's become a Zionist. Just the opposite. He's collaborating because it's in his best interest to do so. Why? Because if he didn't, the more extreme guys, Hamas, and now there's even more extreme guys than Hamas, would threaten the relative stability in the West Bank. So to your point, Congressman Engel, if the PA were to collapse, what we're likely to see is not a more democratic regime, unfortunately. The gap is likely to be filled by an even more extreme bunch. But let's also be fair, if we may. Condemnations of President Abbas are fair, they're legitimate, again, outlined this morning. But everyone here needs to understand what it takes in order to have an election. in the Palestinian Authority. You need 3 approvals. The PA's got to approve, Israel has to approve, because you can't hold an election in Jerusalem without Israeli approval, and you got to have Hamas to approve, because you can't have votes in Gaza, unfortunately, without them. So I'm not casting judgment, but we need to be realistic about the enormous process that would need to be undertaken in order to actually have an election under the current circumstances in the Palestinian territories. You need those 3 actors to agree to some type of election administration.
Thank you. One of the things that is interesting in terms of the geopolitical movement of the Middle East is that if you talk to heads of state, the Sunni Arab states sound very similar to their perspective of the Middle East, to the Israeli leadership, to Netanyahu. He'll talk about Iran and other things, and you talk to the Sunni Arab states, it's the same thing. When you speak with Israeli leadership, they will say there's no conflict with the Arab world. There's a conflict with the Palestinians. But the Arab world, the Sunni world, sees the situation today much like the Israeli government. There is unprecedented cooperation going on behind the scenes between Israel and some of the countries that were long regarded as Israel's enemies. So it's interesting when you look at the Arab League putting forth a comprehensive proposal and a peace plan. There have been media reports recently that Prime Minister Netanyahu was open to discussing the Arab Peace Initiative as the basis for an accord. Israel rightly takes issue with several parts of the proposal, but that could potentially be worked out. To what extent should the U.S. encourage this? Anybody else? Mr. Pollack?
Yeah, thank you very much for the question and the opportunity to reflect on it. I believe that the Arab Peace Initiative is a significant step forward, although, as you and others have pointed out, it doesn't implement itself, and it needs to be negotiated, and it needs to be revised. But I would point out that U.S. support for discussions about the Arab Peace Initiative could be an important new ingredient in this picture going forward. Secretary Kerry achieved an important modification of the Arab Peace Initiative a few years ago when the Arab foreign ministers formally agreed that Israel's withdrawal from occupied territories could be on the basis of new boundaries negotiated between the parties that would allow for territorial exchanges, land swaps, as they're often called, rather than literally on the pre-1967 lines. But that achievement, unfortunately, in the last couple of years has been taken back, walked back by Arab governments and by the Arab League. It would be useful, I think, for the United States to go to them, to the Arab governments, and say, you agreed to this a few years ago. Can we assume that you still agree to it today? Can we proceed on that basis? That would allow for negotiations that would advance this emerging consensus between Israel and key Arab governments that peace is in their common interest. One last point about this. In late 2013, Arab foreign ministers were prepared to go even further at the urging of Secretary Kerry, but they were stopped by objections from the Palestinian Authority. This is not in the public record, but it is a fact. The Palestinian Authority objected successfully and very sadly, in my view, to a willingness on the part of other Arab leaders to accept the formulation of recognition of Israel as a Jewish state or as a state for the Jewish people. And it would be useful today for the United States to encourage those Arab governments to reconsider and to encourage the Palestinian Authority, hard as it would be, and it would be very hard, to reconsider its objections to that formulation. That could be a new and, I think, very hopeful basis for renewed peace negotiations. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Rohrbacher.
Thank you very much. And first of all, I'd like to thank the chairman, Mr. Royce, for conducting this hearing. And I would sign on personally to your concept that we should, if money is going to people who have committed acts of terrorism by the Palestinian Authority, that should be extracted from our commitment to aid the Palestinian Authority. So I think that's a very good step. It's symbolic as well, but needs to be done. I'd also like to especially identify myself with remarks of Ranking Member Engler. His commitment, and as we've heard from the witnesses as well, for a two-state solution has not been dimmed by some of the horrendous downsides and setbacks that we've seen in the last 20 years. And this two-state solution was a solution that was worked out. It was a great deal of optimism that it could work. Let me just suggest, I just got back from the Middle East, and I was in Egypt, Jordan, and Turkey, and the average people in those countries still believe in the two-state solution. And the average people, they're not pro-Israeli, but they understand that to have peace, they need this two-state solution. That was heartening to me. What is disheartening to me is that we have the United States still acting so foolishly that we end up providing hundreds of millions of dollars to people who then spend tens of millions, if not more, building the very tunnels that Ranking Member Engel mentioned. And I remember walking with you down into those tunnels. And by the way, these tunnels are not just little holes in the ground. These are engineering efforts that are very expensive engineering projects that are, I'm sure, cost tens of millions of dollars. And yet, we continue to go along with to make this consistent with what the chairman's saying, we continue to finance them at the same level. I would suggest we make a list, and that when the Palestinians are obviously using their resources to conduct war on Israel, we should extract that from what we are giving to the Palestinian authorities, and et cetera. So with that said, and also it's always great to hear former Congressman Wexler. He's almost as passionate as I am about things, and that's saying a lot. And just one question for Mr. Pollack. You said that it is that perhaps it would be good for Israel to cease its tactic of tearing down buildings. It's my understanding that the Israelis destroy buildings when someone in the family who lived in that building has conducted a terrorist attack and murdered some kind of an Israeli citizen. Don't you think that unilaterally ceasing that policy would not be something that would give them encouragement to stop the type of terrorism that this hearing is all about?
Thank you, sir. That's a fair question. The reality, as I understand it, actually is that, yes, that is current policy of the Israeli government, although they had stopped doing that for many years. They resumed it in the last couple of years in response to the new wave of stabbings and other killings. But The truth is that the Israeli government demolishes many, many other Palestinian buildings for various other reasons. Just, for example, not having proper building permits, not allowing Palestinian construction in certain areas of the West Bank or of East Jerusalem, and so on. And I believe that applied that way, this is a counterproductive tactic.
Well, as long as that caveat was put on in terms of we will continue our destruction of those buildings that have an association, direct association with people who've committed acts of terrorism, well, then I might agree with that.
Yes, sir.
And just one note, the Palestinians lost their land in 1948, all right? We understand that. And the Israelis that started their new country in 1948, they are a nation now. And I agree with Mr. Wexler's analysis that for it to be the Israel that is a separate country and will have some hope, that it's got to be recognized as a Jewish state and the right of return. As long as that is a demand, and that is not, people keep ignoring that issue, as long as that has not been accepted, that the Palestinian refugees from 1948 are not going to be able to go back into what is now the state of Israel, there will be no peace, because there is no, if Israel would never accept that, because it would the end of their country. So I would hope that the Palestinian people decide that they do want to live at peace and accept that there is no right of return and that there is a two-state solution. So let us be optimistic that that someday can be achieved, while understanding that today this terrorism that the chairman has motivated him in calling this hearing, that is dealt with. So thank you very much to the witnesses.
Thank you. We go to Mr. Albio Series of New Jersey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for being here today. Congressman Wexler, nice to see you. See the passion is still there, which is great. You know, I keep thinking about this money that is paid out. I cannot imagine that the donor countries who are trying to help cannot make these payments, cannot help, cannot be, what's the word I want to lose it? What I'm trying to say is, will the will be in those countries to stop payment? Is there a will to do that? Or they just keep running along with the program? Can anybody answer that? I mean, I would think it would be very easy if the will was there to say, well, we're not going to give you any money if you're going to pay for these people, the families of people who commit atrocities. Why isn't the will there to stop that? It seems to me, anyway. Maybe I'm wrong.
Well, it's hard to know what are the motives of the donor countries. They began pressuring, and they hope that this pressure will help. But instead of a real change, they got a virtual change. And really, the point to raise is, I mentioned that that Abbas himself is doing it for the wrong reasons. So why wouldn't they? It is not something that is undone. It is something possible, and Abbas himself is doing it.
But I'm talking about European countries giving money and people committing atrocities. It's not, they get the money, Abbas gets the money and throws it out, but I think it should come from the people who give the money to Abbas to have the will and say, hey, we're not going to give you a dime if you keep using the money for this. I mean, there's no will there. And then yet, you know, they're the first ones to criticize Israel all the time.
So it's also U.S. money.
Well, that...
If I may, directly to the point, but also to the broader, I think, aim of this committee and to each and every member of the committee, which is ultimately assist the parties to create a dynamic in which a two-state outcome is feasible. A homeland for the Palestinian state in a demilitarized Palestinian state and a Jewish homeland in a democratic Israel. Now, rightfully, the chairman and this committee is focused on terrorism and payments and the like. But I can tell you this document that was prepared by 200+ Israeli generals, these guys are not doves. And what they will say first is, yes, go after incitement. Yes, go after terrorism. Yes, do all the things that you're talking about today, but you're still not going to resolve or even begin to resolve the problem. And to resolve this problem, it's going to have to be multifaceted, and it's going to have to address the incitements on all sides, and I am not creating a relativity between terrorism and building houses. I'm not doing that. There's no relativity about terrorism, but we also need to understand that from a Palestinian perspective, Israel occupies the West Bank, and I don't say the term occupation in the politically loaded way, they control it. But when that control is exerted, oftentimes for very legitimate reasons, there are counter-reactions. And we need to understand that if we want to help the parties, we need to address all aspects of that conflict: economic, political, and also people to people, much of what has been discussed. Should security be first? Yes, of course it is. Should terrorism and payments to terrorists be completely not tolerated? Of course. But just to address that, we shouldn't be so unrealistic or naive to think that terrorism is going to be somehow mitigated.
We have to start somewhere. Dr. Pollack?
Yeah, thanks. I think that this is not an all or nothing, or shouldn't be viewed as all or nothing.
Microphone.
Sorry. This should not be viewed as an all or nothing proposition in the sense that we either have to cut off the PA completely or do nothing. I think that
I'm more concerned about the European countries.
Okay.
Because we put stipulations in the money that we give.
Well, yes, but the U.S. stipulations, as my fellow witness here, Mr. Carmon, has observed, have been evaded by the PA through this deceitful technique of funneling money to terrorists and their families under a different name, right? So I think that the United States could, and other countries should, although we can't control what they do in Europe or other places, should reduce the amount or condition the amount of assistance that they provide to the PA without threatening to or without actually cutting it off completely, because there is a real danger, as someone else pointed out, of the PA collapsing, which would be bad for everyone, Palestinians, Israelis, Americans, and the region as a whole. But I do think that a certain calibrated, limited amount of financial pressure applied, again, by the United States without any loopholes or escape hatches, and, if possible, by European and other donors to the PA would be helpful in addressing this immediate issue. And I agree strongly with Mr. Wexler that this is not the only issue on the table, but we do have to start somewhere. I want to say one other last point in this regard. I think it's quite possible in the real world, unfortunately, that if we and or European donors reduce, not cut off, but reduce the amount of assistance to the PA by the amount, say, with which they subsidize terrorists and their families. If we do that, it's quite possible that other unfriendly governments or not so friendly governments would jump in to fill the gap. Arab governments, perhaps others. And that may be, I hate to say it, to be so cynical about it, but that may be the only way in which any of those governments will fulfill their aid pledges to the Palestinians.
Yeah, I do not think that one issue is going to solve everything. It's much more complex than that.
Joe Wilson of South Carolina.
Thank you, Chairman. And I appreciate so much Chairman Ed Royce, Ranking Member Elliot Engel. This is an extraordinary example of bipartisan concern and capable people, and I'm grateful to be here with my colleague Albi Osiris too, and ask questions which really are quite in line. It's just absolutely appalling to me that we have a situation with the Palestinian Authority which is providing rewards to murderers, families. It's pay to slay, and every effort, I think, should be made to stop it. Sadly, this follows the dangerous Iranian nuclear deal, where funding is being provided by the Iranians to Hamas. And we need to remember that just last week, there was another rocket attack at Sederot. And I personally identify with that. I've been to Sederot. I've met a dear lady who was at a park with her children when a rocket attack occurred. She grabbed the closest child, went to a shelter, but the child that she didn't pick up was permanently traumatized. I never want to see American families have to face this. But the thought that we would be allowing any type of financing for pay to slay or for Hamas and its, by releasing funds to Iran, putting American and Israeli families at risk. Along with this, the Palestinian Authority is providing financial support for pay to slay, for terrorism in the region. And Dr. Pollack, and it's been reviewed, but the American people need to know again. So restate, how does the Palestinian Authority provide support to the families of known terrorists? Is it a form of cash, electronic wire transfers, other sources of payment? And what is the total amount that the Palestinian Authority provides in compensation to these families each year? Is there any evidence that U.S. dollars are ultimately ending up in the pockets of the relatives of terrorists? And you've stated it, but state it one more time.
So the documents are there. The information is there. We also possess it. Much of it is online. I have in my hand documents from the Arab Bank and from the Ministry of Detainees, which sets up all the details, everything that, how and where, and it's paid through banks. It's official government operation. It's not some rogue side payment under the table. This is what the PA stands for ideologically and in money. So the information is there. It is, again, the will to act upon it. And I think that it would be a great educational process if that amount of $300 million per year is cut, so people understand through their lives that this path is not the way to get rid neither of the occupation nor of their life conditions.
And thank you again for restating and holding up the records. And if that wasn't clear, of course, the propaganda that you've cited too, and the boasting about the murder of the young lady last week, the teenager stabbing to death, is just incredible. Congressman Wexler, welcome back. In your opinion, what is the impact of the Palestinian Authority's financial support to the families of terrorists on future acts of terrorism? Do you believe these payments encourage and perpetuate further acts of violence?
Of course they do. How could they not? And not only are they destructive, as everyone has described, in terms of the implications for individuals, but they're also destructive in terms of its implication for the two societies. Why should Israelis ever believe that they have a genuine partner for peace when the other side is encouraging the type of behavior that's being discussed? And likewise, if you're a 12, 13, 14-year-old young Palestinian boy and you see the type of behavior that's encouraged on your side, what disincentive is there to go and repeat those kinds of atrocities? But if I may, and not, again, to create any relative type of comparison, but that is why those of us who care so deeply about the security and the well-being of Israel need to make certain that Israel takes independent initiatives on its own behalf to control its own destiny, quite frankly, not wait for the partner to emerge that we all hope would emerge. And that's the kind of behavior, ultimately, as it stands, will actually create a dynamic that might possibly, if the Palestinian leadership wants to become more reasonable, will be able to do so.
Well, thank you very much. Again, I look forward to working with my colleagues to ending pay for slay. Thank you.
Thank you. We go to Karen Bass, California.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. First of all, my hearts go out to the family of the 13-year-old child. I can't imagine what they must be going through right now. But I'm so concerned about the cycle of violence, and I hope that this atrocity doesn't lead to revenge killings like we've seen. And I think both Mr. Wexler and Dr. Pollack have talked about the generals and the desire of the generals to see a different policy. And I wanted to know if you could expand on that a little bit. A couple of my colleagues have mentioned, and I believe you did too, Dr. Pollack, about the policy of destroying homes. And I would imagine the home of the 17-year-old might get destroyed. And then the policy of the PA of giving money to families that have committed these acts. So when a house is blown up, then where does that family go? And is that the money, is that an example of the money that the PA uses? I mean, what happens to, you never hear about that. And you also mentioned other examples of houses being, dismantled because of building codes or whatever. What happens to those families?
Okay, thank you for the question. In my own view, blowing up the houses of families of terrorists, if that actually deters terrorism,
Is there any evidence of this?
I don't know the answer to that, honestly, but if it does deter terrorism, then I think tragically it would be acceptable. Even though, honestly, it's collective punishment. It leaves families who may not actually be responsible for the actions of their children or other relatives. It leaves them homeless. It is something that is very debatable, and as I said, the Israeli government itself had long stopped using that practice and only resumed it in recent years, I would say almost as a matter of desperation, because they were subject to this very deadly wave of stabbings and other forms of
Is this a practice
assault.
that the 200 generals are against?
I don't know for sure, but
No,
I'm
sorry.
I want to just say in connection with that, and allow me to be very frank, with all due respect to any group of generals or others who are well-intentioned and smart and patriotic, here or anywhere, it is the government of Israel that has to make these decisions. And that government is, like it or not, a democratically elected government, and only a democratic election will change that government or its policies.
I believe both of you have made reference to settlements and saying that more settlements shouldn't be approved, but weren't more settlements just approved in the last couple days?
If I may. Obviously, I don't speak for Dr. Pollack, but actually I think we've been talking on the same tune. What we have talked about is the security fence that Israel, in my humble opinion, rightfully built after the last round of Intifada. And unfortunately, for political reasons, they haven't completed the fence, but that's a whole nother story. What Dr. Pollack and I have said is beyond that security fence, meaning east of the security fence, and the route of the security fence was created by the Israeli government, that the Israelis should stop building beyond that fence, because for all practical purposes, based on an Israeli action, the likelihood that that land would ever become a part of an Israeli state in a negotiated outcome is probably 0%. So why exasperate? Why create even additional problems? Dr. Pollack, I think, talked about a trade-off. What he said was, in return for the Israeli government saying they would not, and in fact not building beyond the fence, he talked about a trade-off, then America shouldn't criticize settlement building within the fence. And I think that's a legitimate point. But settlements don't occur in a vacuum, or building doesn't occur in a vacuum. You have to put all the issues before the people. But if you did that kind of action, if the Israelis did that kind of action, their international legitimacy, for those that are at least objective, would go sky high, because you wouldn't be able to just criticize the Israeli government in a wholehearted way without recognizing the fact they've taken an important initial step.
We go to Jeff Duncan of South Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks for this hearing. When I think about the issues of today, I think about the solution. And I think the solution is easy, but the political implementation of that solution seems very, very difficult. Right? When I say solution, I mean the beginning of a solution. And that is the recognition by the PNA, Palestinians, of the Jewish state of Israel's right to exist. Recognition of that state. When I was in Israel in 2011, I talked with Benjamin Netanyahu and Shimon Peres and others who said, you know, if the Palestinians had just recognized our right to exist, it would go a long way to getting us all to the table to start negotiating the things that the gentlemen on the panel are talking about. The solution's easy, but the political implementation by the Palestinians is very difficult. I get that. I get that. But sometimes leadership takes making difficult decisions to move the ball forward. So my appeal to the Palestinians today is recognize Israel. I'm proud to stand as a member of Congress as someone that stands with the state of Israel and support them in any way that I can as a congressman, and we as a Foreign Affairs Committee and the United States Congress can, financially, security-wise, and just verbally, of standing firm in our commitment to the state of Israel. Mr. Chairman, this hearing is important. But it's difficult for me today to focus on Israel and the West Bank and the UN and recognition and funding after I witnessed yesterday in my own country the FBI director erode the very fabric of the foundations of the institutions of government. July 5th, 2016 will be a day that we remember when we saw that the blindfold on the arbiter of the scales of justice was ripped away because the scales of justice are no longer blindfolded. Before yesterday, you were being judged and weighted based on the evidence. But as of yesterday, political influence, party affiliation, race, gender, family ties, you name it, all will factor into justice. America needs to realize that the scales of justice were a blindfold for a reason. It's what set us apart from other countries around the world. I travel extensively through Latin America as chairman of the Western Hemisphere Subcommittee. What sets America apart from countries in Latin America is our impartial justice system, where the facts are weighed. It shouldn't matter what family you were born into, your wealth, your race, your sex. It shouldn't. And we've had an ongoing conversation in the last few years about race and impartiality with regard to race in the justice system. Now we're going to have an ongoing conversation about political aristocracy, political connections, wealth, future aspirations, you name it, will all factor into the American judicial system to its detriment, America. Regardless of how you feel about individuals and individual candidates, surely you believe in the institutions of government. It's a sad day for me. I can't focus on Israel and the topics that the gentlemen on the panel were brought to Washington to discuss. My love for Israel is clouded by my love for the United States of America, because without America, without the things that we believe in, we will not have the ability to support our allies in the region. And I hope everyone will think about that. And with that, I yield back.
We go to Mr. Jerry Connolly of Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Pollock, I'm picking up on your last comment about a democratic government in Israel, and until unless that democratic government has changed, they make the decisions. Surely, however, you did not mean to suggest that this democratic elected government, as the largest supporter of Israel, doesn't have a right to be critical when it thinks its interests, or even Israel's, are at risk.
Absolutely not.
Right.
You're quite right, sir.
Okay.
But
I just want to clarify that. I don't mean to catch up, but because leaving it that way, I mean, we get to be, as friends, critical.
yes, sir.
And U.S. policy is longstanding with respect to settlement expansion and other aspects of the relationship that have critical aspects to them, as well as, of course, longstanding support. I count myself certainly an unswerving supporter of Israel, but that doesn't mean I can't be critical as a friend.
Of course.
Okay. And you can answer this too if you wish, but I'll put it to first Congressman Wexler. Congressman Wexler, okay, so there are problems with the Palestinians. Leadership, funneling of money, as Dr. Pollock indicated, that clearly we find abhorrent. What happens, let's defund the PA, let's close their offices here, let's stop working with them. Would that be welcomed by the Israeli government, in your opinion? And would it help the cause, the peace cause?
It's not my opinion. It's the policy of the Israeli government at successive stages where they were diametrically opposed to certain steps that might have led to a destructive position for the PA. No one's got a greater stake in the success of the Palestinian Authority, and more importantly, a greater stake in the bolstering of moderate forces, or at least of the group, the most moderate forces, than Israel. If the Palestinian Authority crashes, one of two things is most likely to happen. Hamas, or even more extreme elements, take control, or the Israelis have to step in even with greater strength. Either result is a disaster for Israel.
And that's the position of the Israeli government.
Sure, it's been that way through labor governments, Likud governments, Kadima governments, because it's quite frankly so obvious. They need the Palestinian moderate forces to be successful. Now, some could argue when they had that opportunity under Prime Minister Fayyad, who was, not in most respects, from an American and Israeli perspective, the best thing that came along.
A very able administrator.
That's right.
And as far as we know, incorruptible.
Yes. And we didn't do enough, none of us, to push his agenda, quite frankly.
Terrible loss, actually, when we lost him. Dr. Pollock, do you concur, or?
Yes, I do, but as I said, I don't believe that this is an all-or-nothing proposition.
Got it. I agree. I think our choices aren't great, and I think that's always hard for Americans. There ought to be a very clear white-hatted choice and a bad black-hatted choice. We're between a rock and a hard place, but absent the PA, probably either the Israelis have to step in and actually run everything in the West Bank administratively in terms of local government services, or Hamas gains control of the West Bank, which is
what I
not a
mean
desirable outcome.
is that a reduction, not a cutoff, a reduction in U.S. and other funding for the PA.
Right. I specifically, I didn't mean to even suggest you were saying that, but there have been calls here, even on this committee, for total cutoff and close her.
No, I think that would be a mistake.
Okay.
Yes.
Final thing real quickly, Mr. Wexler, you made reference to 200 generals, Mossad leaders, Shin Bet leaders, who have expressed deep concern about the current government in Israel, Netanyahu, and Israel's security. You want to elaborate a little bit on that? What's going on?
Yeah, I don't want to politicize this needlessly. Their concern is not addressed about the government. Their concern is about the policy. Their concern, these are generals. For the most part, almost all of them are not politicians. And what they've put forth is a multifaceted set of policies that will help address the security quagmire that Israel finds itself. The first assumption they make, quite frankly, is that the question of whether or not there's a genuine partner for peace for Israel, they don't care about it. Not because they don't want there to be a genuine partner. What they're saying is, if we wait forever for Abbas or his successors to do the right thing, in the meantime, we're going to be compromised. Our interest, Israeli interest, is going to be compromised. So what they're saying to their own government, to their own people, is these are the 12, 18 steps we could take on our own because, thank goodness, we're strong enough and will enhance our position rather than detract from it. That's what they're saying. It's not a condemnation or a applause for the government. What they're saying is the status quo, the way it remains, if we do nothing, will actually compromise Israel's Jewishness, its Jewish majority, its democratic nature is in question, and its international standing is constantly badgered. Now, for a lot of reasons, that badgering and that criticism is totally illegitimate. But what these security commanders are saying is, if we're going to be strategic, let's at least put forth an international position that allows us to enhance our international relationships as opposed to constantly being on the defensive.
We're going to go to Randy Weber of Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Pollack, I have to say this is the first hearing I've been at where the first witness said, as I see it, our primary task here is not to debate the underlying issues of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict or U.S. policy in that regard. I thought the hearing was over at that point. That's an interesting thought, and then you go on and you say, and that's exactly what we've been doing, by the way, in my opinion. We are debating those underlying issues and how we got here and how those need to change. Then you go on and you lay out 5 proposals, and your 5th and final proposal is that the U.S. should publicly support and very vocally encourage others to endorse what we call mutual and balanced. I thought that was a news station. I didn't know. Oh, that's fair and balanced, isn't it? But if necessary, unilateral steps towards peaceful coexistence. And then you talk about Israelis stopping the destruction of destroying buildings of those who perpetrate such violence on men, innocent men, women, and children. And you don't say in your comments, and I followed you fairly closely, you don't say in your comments anything about there being unilateral action perhaps on the Palestinian side. And so is it totally out of, is it just totally out in left field and unrealistic to say, how about some unilateral action on their side? They stop indoctrinating their children. I'll give you four examples, then I'll give you a chance to respond. Stop indoctrinating their children with the message of hate. Quit calling the Jewish people dogs and apes and animals and then trying to kill them as such. Kick out Hamas. Recognize Israel's right to exist, number 3, and 4th and finally, stop funding the terrorism and those that are in jail. Is there no call for the Palestinians to have any unilateral responsibility, Dr. Pollack?
Thank you for the question. I actually think that I made that call both in my written statement and in my remarks. I said specifically in my remarks, perhaps you weren't here in the room, that the PA should stop referring to.
Well, I'm reading your 5th
as martyrs.
But your 5th unilateral point basically says that about Israel. It doesn't say it in this context. So if I missed it, I apologize.
I think you did miss it, sir, yes. And I accept your apology. But what I would like to say in response is that if you look at my written statement, you will see a long list of unilateral moves that Israel could take and that the Palestinians could and should take, including not referring to murderers as martyrs and recognizing Israel as a Jewish state.
Okay, fair enough. Do you agree with that, Mr. Wexler? That the Palestinians should be called upon initially
to stop the violence from their end?
Yeah, 100%. You had me totally, Congressman Weber, until you said kick out Hamas. I agreed with every word you said. That may trouble you, but I agreed with every word you said.
You agreeing me or the not agreeing with kick out Hamas?
No,
That's the part that troubles me.
I'm all for kicking out Hamas, but we need to understand the reality. The reality is the PA doesn't have an army. The reality is the strongest army in the region, thank goodness, is the Israeli army. They haven't been able to kick out Hamas, unfortunately. So when we say kick out Hamas, and you say the PA should be doing that, with what weapons? They don't have them. Now, I don't want to give them the kind of weapons that it would be required to kick out Hamas. But what we also respectfully need to understand, as much as you disdain Hamas, hate Hamas, as much as I disdain him and hate him, as much as the Israelis disdain him and hate him, Abbas hates him even more than you and me.
So this is the lesser of two evils? Is that like the bumper sticker says, have you hugged your terrorist today?
No,
I mean,
no, I wouldn't go that far. Hamas is a despicable terrorist organization that is designed to destroy the state of Israel. If I could stamp them out tomorrow, if I had the power to do it, I would do it.
So if it's not destroying the buildings whereby the perpetrators live in and people get to understand, if you want the force, you don't have the military weapons, you've got to have the public understand, number one, you don't teach hatred. Number two, those who perpetrate such acts of violence will be dealt with immediately and in a very decisive fashion. Is that wrong?
No, you're right. But here's the problem. Every 2 years, I used to do it too, we'd run commercials, send out leaflets. I imagine in November you'll send out, in October you'll send out a whole bunch of stuff, what Congressman Weber's achieved these last 2 years. So if you're a Palestinian and you're taking a look as to, well, which brand of leadership am I in favor of? Abbas's leadership? He talks about negotiating, or even though he doesn't do it, he talks about a peaceful resistance, and the Palestinian people look at it, even if they're inclined to believe, and they say, what has that bought me for the last 30 years? They don't like it. Whether they're right or wrong, I don't know, but they don't like it. They look at Hamas and their absolutely atrocious behavior. Guess who causes the Israeli government to make a prisoner swap where they give up thousands for two? Hamas, not the Palestinian Authority. So unfortunately, what the Palestinian Authority see is they see that this terrorist group, in certain ways, from their completely distorted, horrific logic, is more effective in representing their interests than the more moderate Palestinian leadership. What we've got to do, respectfully, is encourage our friends, Israelis, Arabs, everybody, and Palestinians, to support and bolster the moderate strength so that they have a commercial to run.
We'll go
Mr. Chairman, I'm going to yield back.
We'll go to Lois Frankel of Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for this hearing. And one of the things I've always been grateful in terms of this Congress, which is often at each other's throats on both sides, is the bipartisan spirit and support of Israel and peace for both Israel and the Palestinians, which is what we're here for, to talk about today. I wasn't going to raise this, but one of my colleagues made such a dramatic statement about his disappointment about something that happened yesterday. I agree in this regard. There was something that happened yesterday that really appalled me, but it's not the same thing that appalled him. One of our presidential candidates, you can just fill in the blank, praised the late Iraq dictator Saddam Hussein. He said, you know what he did well? He killed terrorists. They didn't read them their rights. They didn't talk. They were a terrorist. It was over. Now, as I recall, Mr. Chair, and I'd ask that unanimous consent to have this article put into the record, is I want to just read from an article dated April 3rd, 2002, CBS News. It says, Iraq President Saddam Hussein has raised the amount offered to the relatives of suicide bombers from $10,000 per family to $25,000, U.S. Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld said Wednesday, Since Iraq upped its payments last month, 12 suicide bombers have successfully struck inside Israel, including one man who killed 25 Israelis, many of them elderly, as they sat down to a meal at a hotel to celebrate the Jewish holiday of Passover. The families of 3 suicide bombers said they recently received payments of $25,000. So just for the record, yes, something that I think was disgraceful to American values was any presidential candidate who would praise Saddam Hussein. Now, with that said, I'm going to ask a question, not on that subject. Mr. Wexler, I have been very long interested in your analysis of the demographics in the region, and I am told that you did talk about that earlier in your testimony. So my question to you is, and maybe you can just repeat some of that for me, is what is the incentive for the Palestinians really to not just wait?
Thank you, Congresswoman Frankel. This is part of the problem. Time is arguably on the Palestinian side, not on the Israeli side. If you boil this conflict down, and I don't mean to be simplistic, but there are 3 major components, essentially, at least from an Israeli perspective: land, democracy, and Jewish majority. The unfortunate reality is Israel gets to pick 2 of those 3. They don't get to pick 3. If they take all the land from the Mediterranean to the Jordan River, if they take a great bulk of the West Bank, they're going to either lose their Jewish majority or their democratic nature, which for most of us would be tragic. So Israel's got to choose between 2 of those 3 categories. And what the commanders are choosing, what I hope our allies would help create a dynamic in which Israel feels secure enough, strong enough to choose, is a resolution in which their Jewish nature is assured, their democratic nature is assured, and that they get international borders. Finally, Israel does not have internationally recognized borders. They need internationally recognized borders that are, in fact, defensible. And that's what the Israeli security establishment is so concerned about. They want to get about the job of protecting Israel. But today, that job is so much more difficult because Israel doesn't have internationally recognized borders. And the key component is to create them so that Israel can maintain its Jewish majority and its democratic nature.
We go now to Scott Perry of Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to drag this hearing back to what I thought it was about, which is financially rewarding terrorism in the West Bank, and with an eye towards that. The U.S. policy toward the Palestinians consists of 3 end goals: to establish a stable, I'm just reading them, lasting and peaceful end to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict through direct bilateral negotiations, that's 1. 2, to counter Palestinian terrorist groups, and 3, to establish norms of democracy, accountability, and good governance. Now, the U.S. funding of the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestinian refugees in the Near East, or UNRWA, as we usually call it, runs counter to every single one of these 3 policy goals. UNRWA's ties to what I characterize and what many of us characterize as a terrorist organization, Hamas, both threaten bilateral negotiations and undermine U.S. efforts to counter Palestinian terrorist groups. Since 2006, Hamas-affiliated candidates have held all 11 seats on the UNRWA Teachers Union Executive Board. UNRWA schools use textbooks and materials that delegitimize Israel, denigrate Jews, and venerate martyrdom. These materials work to indoctrinate the Palestinian youth, making them susceptible to radical militant groups such as Hamas. The unfortunate yet foreseeable result of this curriculum can be seen in April 2016 poll that found that 78.6% of the youth in Gaza and 46.4% of the youth in the West Bank support the knife intifada. Furthermore, 76% of the terrorists taking part in the knife intifada were under the age of 30. Now, UNRWA's education system seems to have created a large pool of indoctrinated youth hell-bent on attacking Israelis. UNRWA's employees are screened for ties to terrorism, but the vetting system, believe it or not, focuses on things like al-Qaeda or the Taliban, but does not focus on Hamas or Hezbollah. It's crazy. 95.5% of Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza believe the Palestinian Authority is corrupt, and 82% of Gazans believe Hamas is corrupt. Yet UNRWA effectively works as a support service for both of these organizations, taking care of basic government services. This, in effect, subsidizes, with American dollars, these groups' corrupt and oftentimes terroristic activities. The total annual budget for the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestinian refugees in the Near East, or UNRWA, for FY15 was $1,246,802,614. And since its inception in 1950, the United States has contributed more than $5.6 billion to the agency, more than any other single nation. And in FY15, the United States contributed $390.5 million, making it up 31% of the agency's budget. Do any of you fine gentlemen on the panel object to my legislation, which would prevent U.S. taxpayers from continuing to fund this agency? Sure.
I don't know if I object or I support it. I certainly support the intention, but if I may, let's say you pass your legislation. Let's say it's implemented, and UNRWA in Gaza closes up.
Doesn't close up. We just don't fund it anymore. My tax dollars, your tax dollars, their tax dollars don't fund it anymore.
I get it, and we pay a disproportionate amount of UNRWA dollars based on the UN formula. So when your legislation is successful, and UNRWA no longer can implement the programs it implements in Gaza, the ones you're objecting to, rightfully so, who's going to run the sewer plant, the one that's already pushing sewer into the sea that not only destroys the Palestinian coast, but the Israeli coast? What are those children going to do?
I guess somebody's going to have to make a decision on what their priorities are.
Okay.
Right?
All right.
I say that a dirty sea and sewage is bad, but it's better than people being stabbed, blown up, rocketed, etc.
Totally agree with you.
Okay.
But let's also be realistic. The people with the knives, thank goodness, are not coming from Gaza. Gaza is essentially walled off to Israel. The people with the knives are coming from the West Bank. So what you do in Gaza is not going to prevent the people with the knives. You want to prevent the people with the knives, I would respectfully suggest the Israeli government should complete the security fence and create borders that they're...
That's what they can do, but what we can do is stop funding the training camps that would be described as our elementary schools, our daycares, our middle schools.
Yes.
Right? We're funding that.
And I'm deeply troubled by it.
Troubled?
Yeah.
We got to be more than this. With all due respect, sir.
Yes.
We're all troubled, all right? We're talking about action here. This hearing is about the funding of terrorism, taxpayer funding, and that's why I asked the question.
That's right.
So while we talk about platitudes here, and we're all troubled, and we all are, rightfully so, yourself included, we have an opportunity here to do something.
And all I would suggest is, if you're going to do that, which obviously your bill stands for that, then at least have round 2 figured out on how you're going to achieve your purpose, which is minimize terrorism, not enhance it. So yes, if you're taking that first step, which may be very legitimate, figure out step 2, which is, as the follow-up, how are you actually reducing terrorism as opposed to creating an even greater incentive?
With all due respect, sir, I hear what you're saying, but the policy of that comes to, and I thank your indulgence, Mr. Chairman, what I see as appeasement at some point, that it's my duty to figure out how to solve that problem or I must pay some blood money, extortion. It seems counterintuitive to every moral code that I've ever followed in my life.
And if I may, I couldn't agree with you more, and I would just respectfully suggest that before you reach your ultimate conclusion, you sit down with our Egyptian allies and our Israeli allies and our Jordanian allies and ask them what their suggestions would be for round 2 to make sure you don't make this.
Maybe round 1 can be a forcing function. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Okay, Mark Meadows from North Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this hearing. As you know, this is a passionate area for me, having co-sponsored legislation that suggests that we should close the PLO office here in Washington, D.C., as long as they continue to fund terrorists who commit these kinds of acts. So, Mr. Wexler, you've come up with a lot of suggestions on what the Israelis should do. Do you not think it would be a prudent call to close the PLO office here in Washington, D.C., as long as we're paying terrorists to commit terrorist acts?
Principally.
Just yes or no.
No, it's not that simple.
It is that simple. Let me tell you.
No,
why,
it isn't.
Let me tell you why the problem is.
Yeah.
I've got 5 Jewish young girls over here.
Yeah.
Who don't understand. I don't understand why we can't close a PLO office when I was told by the ambassador that they were not going to fund terrorist activities anymore, and all they did was moved it from the PLA to the PLO. And so what we're doing is we're continuing to do it. We need to close that office. We need to make sure that what happens is at least we send a message. If we can't close an office, then we certainly cannot be serious about addressing this issue.
Then close it.
Why would you not support that?
Because my fear is that when we take actions like the one you're describing, which are totally justifiable based on the facts of what is occurring, that in effect we're rewarding the terrorist inclinations amongst their society as opposed to the more pragmatic ones.
But based on that, your whole philosophy is a philosophy of appeasement.
No,
historically, that has never worked.
Not fair, sir.
Well, that is
my
fair,
philosophy,
because what you're saying is we
my
can't even close
philosophy
an office.
is the philosophy of the Mossad. My philosophy is the philosophy of the Shin Bet.
All right,
the roughest Israeli fighters.
Mr. Wexler, let me come back. Hold on, it's my time.
You're correct.
So let me come back, because I was on the ground in Israel when the latest round of stabbings occurred. And for you to sit here and suggest that somehow this is a goodwill tour, that the Israelis are going to be viewed in a positive light if they just give a little bit more. I was there when Western papers were talking about how it was the Jewish boy's fault that he was stabbed and not the Palestinian. I was there when he was doing the ISIS sign from his hospital bed when they were said that the Israelis had killed him, which was not the fact. I was there on the ground. And so to suggest that somehow building a wall will fix this problem, I can tell you, if the Israeli government felt like building a wall will bring peace, it would be built quicker than any wall you could ever see. But that will not do it, because you and I both know that the Palestinians go back and forth between those walls. I was in a courtroom. I was in a courtroom where I had a Hamas attorney with Palestinian youth that were prideful of the fact that they had committed these atrocities as if they had won a spelling bee. How do we change that?
With all due respect, Israel was suffering from suicide bombs every week, blowing themselves up left and right under Prime Minister Sharon. What was his primary response? He built a wall that was highly controversial internationally. The Palestinians opposed to it. Most of the international operators opposed to it. But Sharon went and built the wall. And guess what? Israel, to the degree, again, it's relative, defeated the Intifada, in great part because of that wall. So with all due respect,
Well, with all due respect,
you
are
can't
are
say a wall won't help. It does help.
No,
greatly.
I
In
didn't,
fact, it's
I didn't say it wouldn't
stage
help.
one.
What I said, it would not solve the problem.
You're correct. It won't.
That was my exact words.
It won't
And-
solve the
and
problem.
what I'm here today to say is if we can't take minor steps like closing a PLO office, then what are we supposed to tell the generations to come? That we would not even take small diplomatic, I mean, we're not talking about cutting off their funds. All we're saying is they can't have an office here in Washington, D.C. Does that not seem like a reasonable compromise?
It is. It is reasonable.
Then why don't you support it?
Because I would just simply ask the question, the day after you close it, have you benefited Hamas and the more extreme elements, or have you changed the behavior
Well,
and
we
sent
know,
the message?
we know that what we've been doing didn't work. We know that they continue to pay terrorists. At what point do we change our philosophy to figure out if some new strategy would work? I'll yield back.
Okay, we go to Mr. Brad Sherman of California.
Thank you, Rob. Welcome back. You may be having more fun in that seat than you had in the seats on this side. It's been suggested that maybe we should have a change in American policy, and we should have an American president who declares that we're neutral between Israel and its enemies. If Israel, and that would, and that the upside of that would be that somehow that neutral president would be able to create peace just by convening a meeting. What are the dangers of the United States declaring that we're neutral, but available to have discussions between Israel and its enemies? And if the United States was not a stalwart friend of Israel, would Panama be the most powerful nation that Israel could count on as a stalwart friend, or would there be some other nation that would rise to the top as being on Israel's side?
I think you raise a very valid point. Neutrality by the United States with respect to Israel and its neighbors would be catastrophic. It would be catastrophic for Israel. It would be catastrophic for America. Quite frankly, I've never understood the term honest broker. I don't understand why we Americans would ever even suggest that America is an honest broker. We are a strong ally of Israel because of shared values, because of democratic values, because of a whole host of moral, ethical, common ties, and the fact that Israel's our closest ally in the Middle East. It would be catastrophic if the world perceived that we moved even slightly away from that very strong position. And what's even stronger is events like what occurred 2 weeks ago, where the Israeli military establishment, I think they were in Texas, or I forget where the F-35 strike fighter plane was delivered effectively to Israel, rightfully so, and they're the only country in the region that has that next generation American technology. That sends the right message both to Israel's opponents and also to our other allies in the region, our Arab allies and elsewise, to encourage them to engage more substantially with Israel.
I would point out that Israel does not lack for honest brokers. Every former prime minister of Britain has offered himself as a honest broker, not to mention everyone who imagines himself winning a Nobel Peace Prize. There's no shortage of honest brokers. Israel does have a shortage of stalwart friends, which is why if we were not among them, I hesitate to think who would be at the top of the list. The Israeli Ministry of Education and the municipality of Jerusalem now allow new versions of the Palestinian textbooks to be used in East Jerusalem. The Palestinian Authority has claimed that they are taking out of those textbooks incitements to violence. Have they achieved this with regard to these new textbooks? And can we, both for those being used in Jerusalem and those being used in the the West Bank and Gaza. Mr. Wexler.
My understanding is that unfortunately they have not achieved any dramatic reduction in the incitement contained in the textbooks. My understanding is there have been certain changes made that are moving in the right direction, but I don't think anyone here would categorize those as even nearly sufficient enough.
And I would point out that we could reduce the amount of money we give the Palestinians and give the Palestinian Authority and give them textbooks, in which case we would make sure that there would be no incitement in those textbooks. I'll ask the other two witnesses, are you familiar with these textbooks, the new version, and how would you apprise them, Mr. Cameron?
We are, at Memory, we are working on this, and we will publish a report about the new textbook.
Can you give us a preview? It'll help sales. Go on.
The previous one was simply the textbooks of the Palestinian Authority and Jordan, a mixture of both. Unfortunately, the Israeli government turned a blind eye to all that, and now it's changing its position. But you know, when Abbas declares that the prisoners are our top priority, this is a message. The money is not coming as some social welfare. It is ideological money. It conveys a message that the fight is the top priority, even though we are not doing it for now. But it's in violation of Oslo, and it's in violation. And for Oslo, they got the recognition from all other nations. So I don't expect.
I'll just point out, if you give the PA cash, you don't know how they'll spend it. If you give them textbooks, we at least know that they can't be misused. Whether they'll be actually used, I don't know. And Mr. Chairman, I believe my time has expired.
Your time has expired, but I must confess that is a good idea to supplant the textbooks with the funding and other forms of education. Let me go then to Mr. Ted Yoho of Florida. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the panel being here, and I think that is a good idea to follow up on the textbooks. Let's see, the meeting today was financially rewarding terrorism in the West Bank, and that's exactly what we see with the Palestinian Authority. I've been here for 3.5 years, and it amazes me because we talk about this, that we're rewarding terrorist activities. We put in a resolution a year and a half ago, Resolution 542, that would cease and stop all payments to the Palestinian Authority until they stop doing what they're doing. And, you know, I've heard the arguments on both sides of this. If we stop this, it'll open up a vacuum. That vacuum will get filled by worse players. For 3.5 years, I've sat here and watched this discussion, and since 2008, we've given approximately $500 million a year to the Palestinian Authority in the name of peace. The American people are being sold that we are giving this foreign aid to the Palestinian Authority in the name of peace. $4 billion. $4 billion of my money, of everybody's sitting here's money, every person in America has paid $4 billion in the name of peace. Yet the Palestinian Authority, through their own laws, which I find they have a National Palestinian Fund, and it goes on to say, financial support for prisoners is anchored in a series of laws and government decrees. The prisoners are described as a fighting sector. The financial rights of the prisoner and his family must be assured. The financial rights of the prisoner and his family must be assured. It also stated that the PA will provide allowance to every prisoner without discrimination. Well, I'm glad to see they don't discriminate. According to the law, the PA must provide prisoners with a monthly allowance during their incarceration and salaries or jobs upon release. They are also entitled to exemptions from payments for education, health care, and professional training. Years of imprisonment are calculated as years of seniority of service in PA institutions. who was ever in prison for 5 years or more is entitled to a job in the PA institution. The PA gives priority in job placement to people who were involved in terrorist activities. Does this sound like a policy to bring peace? Does anybody want to just make a quick comment? Because I want to go out, Mr. Wexler.
The payments to the terrorists and their families are indefensible. A policy for peace, though, is also what we have done relatively successfully in terms of training Palestinian security forces, which today are the forces that work with the Israeli government to maintain a greater degree of security in the West Bank.
Okay, I hear that. And when we put in this resolution, we got some blowback from the Jewish community saying this would be terrible. It would increase more violence. And it reminds me of that essay that was written, I'm sure you guys have heard of it, The Sheep, the Wolves, and the Sheepdogs. It was written by retired Army Lieutenant Colonel David Grossman. And they said there's a certain amount of risk that people are willing to live with. And when the sheep knows his enemy is the wolf, they'll huddle to one side of the pasture because they understand there's a certain amount of risk. They're not going to get everybody, but they'll live with that. But when you introduce an unknown, the sheepdog, the sheep don't understand that that's there to protect them, so they run over to the wolf, their known enemy. And I think that's what we have a situation here, that we know that we're giving money in the name of peace. We've got a history of doing that, and it's not working. And the unknown is what happens if we remove that. And I want to build on what my colleague, Mr. Perry, said, that I think it would focus or change people's focus, and they would have to pivot and say, you know what? The Americans are playing hardball. I don't want to say hardball, but very discreet or very direct, and saying, if these policies continue, we're done. You know, the textbook, as Mr. Sherman brought up, I've heard that for 3 years. We're funding hatred, we're funding terrorism, and I think if we, as an American, as the government, come out strongly and say, our new policy is this, you need to make adjustments in the Palestinian Authority and in Israel, because we're not going to tolerate this anymore. You know, I don't need to remind anybody in here, our government's struggling financially. To spend $6 billion in the name of peace when we can't pay our own veterans, when we can't do things here, I think is unconscionable, and I will not support any money going to the Palestinian Authority. Thank you.
Thank you. We go now to Brendan Boyle of Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and as I've said previously, the way that you and Mr. Engel lead this committee on issues as they relate to Israel's security is admirable and reflects the best spirit of bipartisanship when it comes to foreign affairs for the United States. I always, just in reflecting on what's been going on recently, the 300 or so wounded, the 30 Israelis that have been killed in these knifing attacks. What's been going on now is essentially the slow motion intifada that unfortunately has not gotten as much attention around the world as it should. And I think that a real turning point was clearly everyone talks about Camp David that succeeded in the late 70s, but really you could say the one that had the more effect was the failed Camp David attempt in 2000, which was building up to be the culmination of the Oslo process and a two-state solution and recognition on both sides and resolving most of the outstanding issues. And when Yasser Arafat walked away from that and went back to Ramallah and launched the Intifada, it has led exactly to where we are today in 2016, 16 years later, and so many people have lost their lives and been wounded. And so now here we are in the West, and especially the United States, trying to get the parties back to an agreement that if you read, say, Dennis Ross's account of it, or even Bill Clinton's autobiography, it's pretty clear that whether it be next year or 20 years from now, we're probably going to get a final resolution that looks a lot more like the 2000 Camp David attempt than not. So in terms of getting back to that and how we get back on track and recognizing the current configuration of the Israeli government and an 85-year-old Mahmoud Abbas who is seemingly not interested in peace at all, I want to return to something that was discussed earlier, and that's the Arab Peace Initiative. Because one advantage of the whole, wherever anyone stood on the Iranian deal, one unexpected positive unintended consequence is greater cooperation between Israel and its Arab neighbors. Could that be the genesis of a renewed Arab-led peace initiative that would put pressure on the Palestinian leadership to finally come to the table? For any of you. So, Dr. Pollack, and we can go down the table.
All right, thank you. Yeah, thank you for the question. I would start by saying I hope so, but I'm skeptical. I think it would be in the interest of Arab governments to do exactly what you suggest, but I think that they don't see it that way. They see it, unfortunately, as risky, at least in the short term.
Internally risky with their own domestic political situation?
Yes, internally risky, and probably they also see it as risky internationally in the sense of they're not sure what they would get for pushing the Palestinians back to the table, either from Israel, from the United States, from the international community, and so on. And so I think that without getting our hopes up too high, it would be worth trying, as I suggested in my written statement and briefly in my testimony today. It would be worth it for the United States to try to explore with some of our Arab allies under what conditions and with what expectations and for what returns they would be willing to do exactly what you suggest, to put pressure on the Palestinians to go back to the table. There was some sense that I had that President Sisi of Egypt, for example, about a month or so ago, was preparing to do that. And then he seemed to stop because his sense of possible changes in the Israeli government did not materialize. Today, as I said in my comments earlier, unfortunately, some Arab governments that were more flexible about this 2 or 3 years ago have walked that back. And you now have, for example, the Saudi foreign minister, Adel al-Jubeir, stating in Paris, where he shouldn't have been in the first place for that ill-advised so-called peace conference, stating that the Arab Peace Initiative was unchangeable, that they would not negotiate any amendments to it or show any flexibility about it. That, as I said, is walking back a previous position. But if you walk it back in the wrong direction, maybe, just maybe, the United States can encourage the Saudis or other Arab governments to walk back the walk back in the right direction, which would mean offering Israel a peace initiative to negotiate, not to impose.
So thank you for this question because it's a crucial one. What holds back the peace process or the chances to move ahead? And the Arab peace plan, in its original form, when the Saudis suggested it, did not include the right of return, which is a no-starter. Later, in a meeting of the Arab League, it was included and thus became the Arab peace plan. With the right of return, of course, nothing can happen. And if it is unchangeable, then there is no change in the Arab position. Only with a change on this point can there be anything moving ahead. And this is also the position of Abbas. Why everything stopped? Because he insists on the right of return. When Prime Minister Barak suggested 100% of the territory through swap of land, what remained there to be holding it back? Only the demand for the right of return. So unfortunately, the Arab peace plan is no starter either, as long as it is unchangeable. And the tragedy of it is that the Saudi foreign minister says it, while the Saudis who initiated it, and in their initial suggestion, it did not include the right of return.
If I may, Mr. Chairman?
Mr. Wexler.
I think the proper construct is this, and your point is excellent. From 1948 until the Israeli-Egyptian peace treaty, the entire focus of the region was regional war against Israel. When Israel made peace with Egypt, the prospect of regional war diminished substantially. When Jordan and Israel made peace in 93, 94, the likelihood of regional war essentially was extinguished. With the Arab Peace Initiative, I think both Dr. Pollack and Mr. Carmen are correct, but I don't think that should be the ultimate message. Yes, skepticism. Yes, look at the fine print, and it's not where it needs to be. But with the advent of the Arab Peace Initiative, we went from the reality of regional war against Israel to the prospect, in its infancy, admittedly, the prospect of regional peace. Now, where I would beg to differ with Mr. Carmen is in looking at the language of the right of return in the Arab Peace Initiative. Is it where Israel would need it to be to ultimately agree? Of course not. But the actual language is just and agreed. And the Arab position, and I'm not suggesting we accept it, but the Arab position is that by adding the word agreed, they were recognizing that there would be no right of return unless Israel agreed, and of course Israel would never agree to hundreds of thousands of Palestinians coming into Israel, so therefore they were making a concession. Whether it's true or not is not the point. The point is it's an opening. Right. It's an opening that should be explored, and with all due respect, saying that we know that the Arab Peace Initiative is not amendable or not changeable, well, we know it is, because they came a year and a half ago or 2 years ago and made a change in terms of they went from 67 lines to 67 lines with limited territorial swaps. Again, not where the Israelis need to be, but movement in the correct direction.
Okay, Mr. Ron DeSantis of Florida is next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank the witnesses. This is really a frustrating issue because we've been raising it time and time again, and I really appreciate, Mr. Carmen, your testimony laying it out. These are huge payments that are going to Palestinian terrorists. I mean, you start talking about people who've committed really heinous acts, and they're breaking in $3,100 a year or a month. For a Palestinian Arab, that's got to be better than 99% of the people who don't have access, who don't own an oil field in the whole Middle East. So that's major, major money. And what that evidence is an unambiguous policy to promote terrorism. It's really no different than what this committee rightfully will criticize the government of Iran for doing, sponsoring terrorism. And this Congress has responded to that with sanctions in a variety of contexts to counteract Iran's policy of support for terrorism. And we really have something similar here, and I think we need to act to try to change the policy. Mr. Carmen, you made the point in 2014 there was the policy change so that these payments no longer came from the Palestinian Authority and they're done from the PLO. Why did they make that change?
It was under the pressure of donor countries.
Because the donor countries don't want to be accused of funding the payments to terrorism.
Absolutely.
However, money is fungible. There's a certain amount of things they have to do. So if you then say the terror payments will come out of the PLO, that just means that some of the money that the PA is getting will go to other things. If that money was removed because you are still funding terrorists and you're still paying them, then they would have to make decisions. And so I don't think that any of these countries can have a clear conscience simply because they've kind of shuffled the deck chairs around a little bit and are saying, well, no, it's actually not from the PA. This is all being worked together. And I think that this is one example, but correct me if I'm wrong, I think your organization has reported on this. Doesn't the Palestinian Authority lionize terrorists by doing things like naming parks and sports stadiums after them?
definitely. The message is respect, legitimation, respect, and even heroization of those who are involved in these acts.
And I also note, I know there's varying views of Mr. Abbas on this panel for sure on the Foreign Affairs Committee, but this is a guy whose dissertation was in Holocaust denial. And you can say that he's not as bad as some of the other guys like Hamas or whatever, but this is not necessarily somebody who is a full-fledged supporter of a lasting peace. And I think incitement has really become endemic to this culture. You look at not only the textbooks, some of the programming, and the viciousness with which they attack Jews, particularly Israeli Jews, but people that are different from them, I think is just absolutely horrifying. And I was very, very disgusted to see after this Tel Aviv attack in June, brutal attack at this cafe, you had people in the Gaza Strip, Palestinian Arabs, and in the West Bank. They were cheering that. Isn't that correct, Mr. Carmen? That was cause for celebration?
There was, yes.
So I appreciate a lot of the comments that we've heard. I know there's this complicated issue, there's a lot of things, but to me, the overriding problem is the behavior of not just the Palestinian Authority or Hamas per se, but really the majority impulse in the culture is one that simply does not recognize Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state and really doesn't seek a two-state solution to the extent they want that as something for a lasting peace, but really as one step in the direction to ultimately seek Israel's destruction. And until those underlying dynamics change, I don't think you're going to see a lot of possibility to, because here's the thing, you go to, there's difference of opinion in Israel, but the Israeli population has showed time and time again, they're willing to make very significant concessions to achieve a lasting peace. And I have no doubt about that. I know people can criticize this policy or that policy come out of the government. But that is just, to me, unquestioned. It's not even close that the Palestinian Arabs have demonstrated that in any type of broad sense. So here we are with the funding issue. I don't think we can allow tax dollars to be going to this entity knowing that they're working in cahoots with the PLO and that these payments are being made. Not only is it when you subsidize something, you're going to get more of terrorism, but it's also just the moral blot of any entity that wants to reward this type of activity, I think is something that we absolutely cannot have anything to do with. So I really appreciate the chairman calling the hearing. I've enjoyed listening to all the witnesses and their testimony, and I yield back.
Yes,
Chairman?
Dr. Pollack.
Yes, if I may, just, I know that we've used up a lot of time. I want to just end with this comment on my own behalf. I would suggest trying to be constructive. If we can perhaps reach a consensus that the money that the PA uses to fund terrorists and terrorism should be deducted from the taxpayer support that the United States provides to them. Perhaps at the same time, it could be transferred to the kinds of activities that I suggested that would be constructive for both Israel and the PA, for Israelis and Palestinians, to support, for example, an international fund that would enable people-to-people and interfaith dialogue and cooperative activities between Israelis and Palestinians on the ground. I think that kind of approach might have the virtue of not being purely punitive, but also constructive. Thank you.
I believe that this money is ideological money. It reflects an ideology which we see in the insistence on the right of return. I would also like to be positive and suggest that the main focus of U.S. foreign policy would be in this respect on demanding of the PLO to stop with this non-starter. Mr. Abbas sent his special envoy to the Herzliya conference just a few weeks ago, Mr. Ahmed Majdalani, who said there, all refugees must go back to their homes. So this is the position, and the money is just a reflection of it. This is what has to be changed, and of course the money too.
And Mr. Wexler.
Well, first, Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you for what I think has been a terrific discussion, and thank you for doing it. On the funding question itself, I think we must reiterate, though, that the State Department did, if I understand it correctly, cut $80 million in fiscal year 2015 to the Palestinian Authority. So maybe, not maybe, if you want to achieve, if this committee wants to achieve its purpose, then it needs to broaden the universe in which our funding is not allowed to go ultimately one way or another, and maybe there's language that can accomplish that purpose. I'm not, there's no representative of the Palestinian government here, and I'm surely the furthest thing from it. However, and we rightfully condemn their heinous actions. This is a good example in terms of the funding. But on the right of return, this record would be incomplete if it did not include the fact that Mr. Abbas, President Abbas, when asked, his hometown is Sfat, if I understand it correctly, and when he was asked on a public show whether his intention was to return to his hometown, he said yes, as a visitor. And I understand I won't live there forever. And then I understand afterward he dialed it back and made it in language that might be more agreeable to many in his own population. I'm not trying to color it one way or the other. The point I'm only trying to make is these are questions of degree, as unsatisfactory as they are. They need to be negotiated at the negotiation table. And I would close with this. Our ultimate goal should be to create a dynamic in which the Israelis and the Palestinians can agree to a two-state outcome. In the interim, we should encourage those independent steps that preserve the likelihood or the ability to achieve a two-state outcome when the politics of the region allow those two groups to get there.
Well, we appreciate the time of our witnesses today. As we have heard, if we are to have a real chance at peace, the practice, and this is my focus, this practice of financially rewarding terror in the West Bank must stop. And that includes conversations with Europeans and others, but internationally, it's a non-starter to have a circumstance in which this slaughter continues, and it's aided and abetted by a system that is paying people and teaching people how to carry out murder, how to slay others. And I, again, thank our witnesses, and at this point, we stand adjourned.